we are going to prepare a piece of chromatography paper for a paper chromatography experiment. So take your rectangular piece of chromatography paper and draw 1 centimeter from the long edge a straight line in pencil, which will serve as a guideline for where to add your dyes. Prepare to place the dyes separated such that you can fit 8 dots, 8 dyes along the pencil line. With all of the dots completed, you can now add your first dye. Each dye will have in it, on its side, a piece of capillary glass, which is a very thin tube of glass which will suck up some of the dye from the reservoir, and then by touching the capillary rod to the chromatography paper, you can form a small dot. If the dot is not quite the right size, then you can allow the dye to dry for a moment and then reapply a second amount of dye. Having added the dyes to the chromatography paper, we can now prepare to do the chromatography. So we can roll the paper into a cylinder and we can secure it using a staple, but we want to be very careful and make sure that the edges of the paper do not touch each other. Here's one we prepared a little bit earlier, so you can see that the paper is not touching. And now we can lower the chromatography paper with the pencil line at the base of the cylinder into the Berzelius beaker, which already has the solvent within it. Make sure that the chromatography paper is not touching the side of the beaker. And then you can take a watch glass, this shallow dish of glass, and use it as a lid to ensure that no dust or debris fall into the chromatogram. And then we can just wait for the chromatogram to develop. How to begin the analysis of your chromatograph. We've already unraveled the chromatograph from a cylinder and laid it flat on a paper towel. And you'll see that we've already marked with a pencil a line showing the height that the solvent front reached. We can now begin making some measurements on the chromatograph. We'll start by looking at the purple dye on the right-hand side. The first measurement that we need to take is how far the solvent front moved for the dye at that position. So we're looking at the distance between the lower pencil line and the upper pencil line, which is approximately 8.5 centimeters on this chromatograph. So we would write that number down as the distance that the solvent front moved. Now we'll look at the dye itself, and we want to measure from the pencil line to either the most intense part of the coloring of the dye, which would be towards the top in the center, a measurement of about 7.4 centimeters, or we could measure to the very edge of the dye, which is a little bit further, about 7.6 centimeters. However, whatever we choose to do, we should be consistent throughout. We can then obtain the RF measurement by dividing the distance that the dye moved by the distance that the solvent moved.